So welcome once again to Email Accessibility, how to make email for everyone in 3 easy steps. So today we're going to go through a whole bunch of stuff related to email accessibility. We're going to look at some of the facts about why accessibility matters in email marketing. We're going to look at some of the best practices you can implement in your own email campaigns to make more accessible emails. And then we'll talk about some of the ways that you can convince stakeholders, your bosses, to invest in email accessibility for your subscribers, as well as talk about some of the things that Limis has been doing recently to support the email accessibility movement. I'm Jason Rodriguez. I'm the community and product evangelist over at Litmus. I've been here for quite a while. I've been more and more focused on email accessibility and helping others send better emails for their subscribers, regardless of their abilities. And I'm joined today by Alice Lee, our principal email engineer over at Litmus. Hi, Alice.
Hi, glad to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So we're really excited to dig in all this stuff. We did want to remind everybody that we just released the Ultimate Guide to Email Accessibility, our ebook, that you can get at limis.com/ebooks/ultimate guide to email accessibility. Definitely check that out. It's going through a lot of the same stuff that we're talking about today, but in far greater detail than we could during an hour-long webinar. And it has all these great tips and best practices for creating more accessible emails. So definitely check that out. But the first thing we want to talk about is really defining email accessibility. So when we think about accessibility, we're basically boiling it down to this. We say that when an email's content is available to and its functionality can be operated by anyone, regardless of ability, that means you're creating a really accessible email experience. You're not really forcing anybody to jump through hoops to read or listen to the content in your email, and then they can take action with your email. They can clearly see links and buttons. They can take action with those. So it's really about making email campaigns that are usable by anyone, regardless of whatever abilities or disabilities they might have. So there's a lot of different ways this actually plays out, which we'll get into a little bit later on in the webinar. But it's really important to just think about that. How can we make emails more accessible to everybody? And there's a couple of reasons that we found that why accessibility matters so much. The first one is obviously that email makes tons of money. So email on average has a huge ROI, far more than pretty much any other marketing channel. So that's social, native ads, SEO, any of that stuff. Email routinely blows it out of the water. So that's kind of key point number one is we all know that email marketing is an extremely valuable marketing channel and it generates tons of money for businesses. But we also know that there's a ton of people in the world that have some sort of disability. The World Health Organization released a study recently that said 1.3 billion people have some sort of visual impairment. So they could have some sort of low vision disability. They could have be considered legally blind. But that's a huge number of people that are contending with disabilities that impact their lives on a daily basis. And it definitely impacts how they interact with technology, and specifically for us, how they interact with email campaigns. There's a lot of legislation out in the world that dictates how and why people need to make more accessible experiences. In the US, that takes the form of things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. We have Section 508 compliance, which dictates government institutions requiring them to be accessible and create their digital applications to be accessible for users. There's the Equality Act of 2010. There's guidelines like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But all these things, depending on what industry you're working in, you might be beholden to these laws to create accessible experiences for everybody. But then at the end of the day, we talk about how valuable email marketing is. We talk about how many people have some sort of disability to contend with. And that means big money that people are potentially leaving on the table, that companies are forgetting about if they're not investing in email accessibility. So the ROD group showed that there was, what is this, $1 trillion in annual disposable income from people with disabilities. And that's a huge pile of money that we're not really focusing on if we're not creating these accessible email experiences. One of the things I really like talking about too, anytime we talk about accessibility, is this idea of the persona spectrum or the ability spectrum. that was kind of put forth by the Microsoft team. They have this great resource called the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit, where they talk about how Microsoft focuses on inclusion and accessibility and really helping people with disabilities. But one of the things they make clear is that at some point, we all have some sort of disability that we have to work around. That could be a permanent disability. Somebody could be missing a limb, they could be blind, they could be mute, and they're going to have to figure out ways to use technology to communicate with other people. But that can also be temporary disabilities. You know, you could have a broken hand, you could have just had your eyes dilated. There could be situational things like you're driving and you don't want to, you need to look up some sort of information in your inbox to find directions or something like that. Or you could be carrying something where you can't interact with your device as well as you normally do. So there's all these things that we need to contend with. It's not just permanent disabilities, but it's temporary and situational disabilities too, that we need to focus on to create these better, more accessible email campaigns for people. So it's not always just about the money, although for a lot of stakeholders, for a lot of bosses and companies, that's kind of the bottom line. We can use that data, make that case for why we should be investing in accessibility. But more importantly, it's because when we make more accessible emails, we're making better emails for everybody, regardless of their abilities. So people with permanent disabilities, temporary or situational disabilities, when we create accessible emails, all of those people can use those emails much more effectively, and it's a much better experience for those subscribers. So we have a poll for you. We want to hear what you're doing when it comes to email accessibility. So I'm going to have Whitney start our poll here. So we're just asking you, do you currently work accessibility best practices into your emails? So feel free, I'll give everybody a minute to say yes or no, kind of join in the poll there and let us know how you're thinking about accessibility, whether or not you're actually implementing some of the things we're going to talk about today or your own ideas for creating more accessible emails. So I'm seeing some interesting numbers coming in here. A lot of people voting, which is great. Give it just a minute before we close it. All right, it looks like it's slowing down, so we can close that out. And it looks like it's kind of half and half. 52% of you said that yes, you are using these accessibility best practices in your own email campaigns. 48% said no, they're not currently. So this is interesting because in our own research, we've seen that there's a big gap in priorities when it comes to email accessibility. So 77% of brands surveyed said that email accessibility is in fact a priority, but only 8% of brands were following a lot of those best practices for making accessible emails. So it's good to see all the attendees here that at least half of you are focusing on creating more accessible email experiences. But industry-wide, there's still this massive gap that needs to be narrowed so that people can create better email experiences for all their subscribers. So at Limis, we've done a bunch of stuff recently to try and invest in accessibility and help others do the same. Most recently, we've released an update to the Litmus application and checklist to have accessibility checks. We have the accessibility checker, which will go through, automatically look at your email and tell you whether or not there's specific accessibility issues that you need to address before sending a campaign. One of the best parts of this is that we actually have a screen reader preview that not only will read your email out loud to you, but it'll provide you with a transcript as well. But this is one of the most eye-opening experiences that a lot of email marketers can have when it comes to accessibility, is actually hearing what your email sounds like to somebody that's using assistive technology like a screen reader. I remember the first time I heard this, I think it was Mark Robbins. I played a clip of an email from a screen reader on stage at Limis Live a couple of years ago, and everybody just kind of fell silent because it's such a mind-blowing experience. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. Go in to checklists, run a checklist, and you'll see those accessibility checks in there, and you'll be able to hear your own email and see how it sounds to somebody using assistive technology. We've also been talking about and highlighting some tools that people can use in their own emails. This is an example of the accessibility switcher, which was originally developed by Paul Airy from Beyond the Envelope. And he wrote this great article about why and how you can implement something like an accessibility switcher inside of your own email campaigns. So this was our own version, which allowed people to see the standard email, view larger text, and then view a kind of high contrast mode. inside of the Litmus newsletter, which was pretty cool to see. And we've seen more people kind of talking about that concept and using it in their own campaigns, which is awesome. Over on the blog, we've been publishing tons of blog posts around accessibility, especially the last couple of months. So a lot of tips from a copywriting perspective, design development perspective, as well as highlighting some of the tools and some of the resources that we put together for people to create more accessible emails. And again, we released the Ultimate Guide to Email Accessibility, our ebook that goes into all of these topics, which is kind of our Bible around email accessibility that we use to try to make more accessible emails for our subscribers. So this all begs the question, we've looked at why creating accessible emails is important, some of the resources that we have available for creating more accessible emails, but let's dig into the heart of the topic. What are some of those ways that we can address our accessibility in our own email campaigns? And it kind of breaks down into 3 categories, which we're going to go through. I'm going to talk a little bit about copywriting an email as one step, and then Alice is going to go through a lot of the design and development details to see how code and visual design can impact accessibility in our email campaigns. So when it comes to copywriting, it's kind of boils down to this. We want to make sure that we write copy that everyone can understand. So that usually boils down to creating simpler copy, getting rid of a lot of jargon inside of your copy, and making sure that it's really easy for people to scan through, to actually read, and to understand. And there's some really concrete suggestions by the W3C working group. They're the ones that work on the web content accessibility guidelines and do a lot of that research and the development of good accessibility practices. But in the web content accessibility guidelines, they specifically say that there are people with disabilities, including reading disabilities, even among highly educated users that have very specialized knowledge of whatever that subject matter happens to be. But it's possible to accommodate these users by making text more readable. And there's some visual ways we can do that with our design, but a lot of it comes down to just writing simpler copy, writing things that sound like a human speaking rather than a computer just generating whatever that copy happens to be. And the simpler we can make our copy, the better it usually ends up being. So Tom Tate last year at Litmus Live, one of our speakers, did a little math for us and said that the average adult reader can read 250 to 300 words per minute. And if the average reading time for an email is 11 seconds, then the ideal length of an email is around 50 words, which is way less than even the old Twitter kind of limit for a tweet. But that 50 words is it's crazy to think about, like, if that's the ideal for an email, then what kind of copy do you have to edit down to get to that 50-word length? Again, I don't think that's just kind of illustrating a point on Tom's part, but it's definitely something to think about. Is we want to make sure that we write copy that people can read very clearly, they can understand very quickly, and that doesn't distract them from the main goal of an email campaign. There's a lot of tools out there too. In the ebook, we go into the Flesch-Kincaid reading score, how that score is from 0 to 100, and there's a bunch of tools you can use to determine the Flesch scale or the Flesch score for your email campaigns. But there's tools out there that will let you know whether or not your copy is too jargon filled, too hard to read, too advanced for a lot of subscribers, and that's a good first step for writing and simplifying that copy. The other thing we want to do is localize our content for global audiences. We're all sending to largely global audiences. The world's more connected than ever. And we want to make sure that our content is localized for those audiences. So not everybody around the world uses the same terms. There's a lot of different cultural differences between audiences depending on where they are around the world. So we want to go not just into translating that content, using an online service to translate that content wholesale, but really taking into account the local customs for your audience and make sure that you're not excluding anybody just based on where they are in the world. So a lot of that comes into the copy that we're writing for our audience. So definitely think about that, how we can make more localized content for the audience and how we can simplify that content so that it's more usable by a wider range of email subscribers. Alice, I'm going to kick it over to you to talk about all that good stuff, the design and the code. So feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Jason. So obviously design is integral to the clarity and readability of your content. So naturally, it plays a crucial role in the accessibility of your emails too. Next up, we're going to take a look at some ways to optimize your email designs so that your content can be easily read and understood by everyone. The first accessible design step to take is use real text. Using image-based emails might be a quick way to turn around new email designs, but overall, they're not a great user experience. Not only for people with accessibility concerns, but also for many email clients and individuals who might disable images by default for security reasons or personal choice. So image-only emails not only make it difficult for assistive technology to read and navigate your content, it also becomes a stumbling block when visually impaired people might need to, say, zoom in on your content. And when you use real text, not only does the copy stay sharp when you enlarge it, but it will usually wrap properly to avoid your user having to scroll horizontally as well as vertically to read it. This is especially important when someone is browsing your email on like a tiny phone screen. Otherwise, real text is also ideal for screen readers as well as assistive technologies that help people navigate emails. Next step, create a strong visual hierarchy. No one likes being hit by the TLDR huge wall of text, right? So consider that if your message isn't easily scannable, then people who might have reading or other cognitive disabilities might have an even harder time with it. So creating a strong visual hierarchy means thinking about how to structure your content with a clear layout, including leading with headlines in a large bold font, very obvious call to actions, and giving enough breathing room between your sections to separate them. And while you're thinking layout, be sure to plan to left align any copy that breaks into more than 2 lines, and especially to be aware of how your copy flows onto smaller screens like mobile devices, because you're basically aiming to keep the starting edge of your text straight to provide like a uniform anchor point when someone is reading through your copy. So this is especially important for people who might have reading disabilities like dyslexia. And another way to support having clear, readable design is by keeping a high contrast ratio between your background color and your foreground elements like text or images like icons. There are plenty of tools out there that help you measure contrast ratios. Some of my favorites are like contrast-ratio.com and checkmycolors.com, and colors is spelled in the British way. So other than setting your background and foreground colors, you can also play with using thicker or larger fonts to increase the separation between the copy and the background. And if you're using background images behind your copy, be sure to set a fallback background color that contrasts well with the text so that your users can still read your email with the images off or if the background image is slow to load. So having a good contrast ratio generally keeps your email readable for most people, but don't forget to check your colorblind view as well. And you can do that right in Litmus previews on Builder or Checklist. Another way to optimize the readability of your email is by setting a dark theme. So dark mode themes have been gaining popularity across all sorts of apps in recent years, like Apple's Mac OS or Twitter, not only because they reduce eye strain and glare, but they have the added bonus of drawing less battery power from your devices. So for dark mode email clients like this Apple Mail screen, and now actually Microsoft Office Outlook, there unfortunately still isn't really a way to target the media queries you'd use to customize the dark mode layout. But you can always experiment with trying like darker designs overall, or trying something like an accessibility switcher like on the previous screen that allows users to control it themselves. And if you wanted to do something like that, of course, as we mentioned, you can check out Paul Airy's blog post on this accessibility switcher, as well as my community post on how we adapted it to Litmus's newsletter for this month. There's also the issue that's been brought up where email clients like Outlook and Apple Mail might be auto-converting emails to dark mode, and that might cause some email designs to become lower contrast than initially intended. So if your goal is to prevent the dark mode from altering the layouts, just make sure your background color is specified in the body tag, and that usually does the trick. The spacing between your lines of text is super important for readability. Designers call it leading, developers call it line height, but whatever you call it, you want to strike a balance between being so close that it's like hard to tell apart the lines of text or hard to tap on the links in your copy, or so far apart that it's difficult to find the start of the next line. So the W3C recommends keeping your line height about 1.5 times your font size. And we generally recommend like a minimum font size of at least 14 pixels. So plugging in 1.5 times 14 into your calculator would give you a calculated line height of 21 pixels, for example. And something I love seeing in emails is hover effects. And it's not just for the cool factor either, but I have to admit it helps. But really, adding hover effects is also a great way to increase accessibility, actually. So think about it. With static emails, the only indicator that you're mousing over something clickable is like the tiny mouse cursor changing. And usually that's too subtle to register for a lot of folks who don't have any kind of visual impairment to begin with. And then there's the colorblind folks who might not even be able to tell if your text is linked if you're just styling your links to stand out from the copy with just color. So we want links to behave differently from any other unlinked copy or image in your layout because we want people to know when and where to click through. And a great way to do that is just to add a hover effect. So single column layouts also help accessibility by reducing the cognitive load your users would endure if they had to keep shifting their focus around your layout. Having a fluid percentage-based single column layout or a layout that responsively turns into a single column layout on mobile is also the simplest way to ensure that all of your content fits cleanly in your user's screen to, again, avoid forcing them to scroll around too much. When it comes to code now, there are some simple but powerful tweaks that you can do to go a long way to improving your accessibility, especially when it comes to folks who are using screen readers or other assistive technology to navigate their emails. And with more and more people starting to use voice assistants like Siri, Echo, or Google Home to read their emails, coding for accessibility is becoming even more crucial. So for example, here is how this litmus header logo section would sound coded in a non-accessible way.
This should not be accessible. Table with 1 rows and 1 columns, row 1 column 1 table with 1 rows and 1 columns, row 1 column 1 table with 1 rows and 1 columns, row 1 column 1 out of table. Link graphiclitmus.com UTM campaign equals Soina. Table with 1 rows and 1 columns, row 1 column 1.
Yeah, that's not fun for anyone, is it? And here's how the same thing sounds coded accessibly.
This should be accessible. Link graphic litmus.
Way, like huge difference, way better. So the big difference between how we coded those two headers is in the table roles. These days, a lot of people still need to use tables in emails to support Outlook specifically, but because table tags were originally intended for tabular data like graphs, screen readers think it's super helpful to read out each column and row like designation before they even get to the content side of it. So not so helpful for email. With email, most of our tables are for layout and presentation, so we can hide all of this extra noise from screen readers by just setting your role attribute to presentation or none. Presentation is still preferred because it has the best support though, and you have to remember to set it on every table because the role doesn't get inherited if you just set it to the parent table. So similarly to how screen readers attribute this meaning to table tags that you have to override with a role, they also attribute different meanings to all the other tags you use in your code. So that's why using semantic HTML is so important. So for example, you might have 2 headlines in a typical email. Your first and most important headline should be an H1 tag. And the guideline is to only have 1 H1 tag per email because it should be considered the title for your entire document. So for every other heading tag, H2, H3, H4, so forth, you can use multiples of those as long as they appear in the correct consecutive order in your code. So instead of just adding text styling to TD or divs in your body copy is in, it should live in either a P tag that defines it as a paragraph if you're going for like a block of multiple lines, or a span tag, or if you're trying to style a short piece of inline text within another tag. So like if you want to set a different font within your paragraph, that's when you use a span tag. Also, be sure to keep an eye out for our upcoming blog post on how to code accessible bulleted lists, where I'll delve into how to code them without tables and have it still work in Outlook. So while always using live text is ideal, images are often inevitable in an email. And sometimes we have to use image text for things like logos or any other kind of branded styling. So what happens is when some screen readers come across an image tag, they might start reading out the entire image URL, as you might have heard in the example before. And that, again, is never a great experience. So how do we make sure an image is accessible to screen readers? By including alternative text in the form of an alt attribute in your image tags. So the screen reader will use the alt text, will read the alt text aloud instead. So this is also critical to people viewing images off emails because they'll at least see the alt text in its place. And bonus, if you apply inline font styling to your image tag, you'll also be able to style your alt text for when this happens. And something that I've occasionally seen in email and I've been asked to do myself by clients is to add a title tag to images, because there's this whole myth that it improves your SEO, but if that was ever true, it's not true anymore. So the places that title text might be useful is mostly like for web and not for email anyway, so like for frames and such. And title attributes are actually not recommended by most accessibility resources outside of those like web elements. There are lots of reasons to avoid title text, but the simplest reason to avoid title attribute is because it overrides your alt attribute anyway. So if you're changing your alt and title text with each email, it just adds this extra layer of redundancy and gives you room for error. Like, what if you change your title text and then you forget to change your alt text? Then the alt text that appears is like the outdated one. And, you know, I would just say keep it simple and just use an alt tag instead. But of course, not every image needs alt text like logos do. If your image doesn't have text in it to provide information or call your user to action, and it's just decorative, you want to avoid adding too much extra noise to your screen reader experience overall, because it's going to detract from your overall message. But that doesn't mean you should leave your alt attribute out entirely. As I mentioned on a previous slide, that could mean that some screen readers would instead just read out the entire image URL. And what you should do in this case is just add an empty alt attribute that will prevent anything from being read out at all. And last but not least, setting the language attributes in your emails is becoming more important as we are starting to focus on localization. The lang attribute basically tells your screen reader what language to read your emails in, which is pretty important because you wouldn't want like a Spanish language email to be read out in American English, like hola instead of hola, or a French email to start with bonjour. And if you have multiple languages in the same email, next slide, please. Oh yeah, you can always add the lang attribute along with your correct language code in the copy's parent tag. So that can be a span tag like we have here, or it can be a P tag, an H1, H2, H3, and so on and so forth. Back to you, Jason.
Awesome. Yeah, I feel like all those are amazing tips for building more accessible emails. So thank you, Alice. One of the things that comes off pretty frequently when we start talking about email accessibility is this perception that people don't want to invest in it, or you have to deal with a boss or some stakeholders that don't really think it's something that you need to deal with. So how do you, this kind of begs the question, how do you go about doing this? How do you make the case for investing in email accessibility? Because we've seen that it's such an important thing to invest in. We looked before at all those numbers, how much money you're potentially leaving on the table, how many users you're kind of actively excluding if you're not building accessible emails. And then there's the issue of actually going through and looking at your emails and identifying where you can make those improvements. So we've kind of put together a step-by-step framework for trying to make that case and trying to get the resources, whether it's time, money, outside consultants, whatever you need to create these more accessible email campaigns for all of your subscribers. So step one is always going to be presenting your case. So we try in the Ultimate Guide to Email Accessibility to give you some of that data that is really useful when you're trying to present that case. So it's really about gathering a lot of this data that's out in the world, and there's tons of data, tons of research and reports on accessibility issues, on the number of people with any specific type of disability, how much money they control, all this stuff that we've kind of touched on before. But we were just really scratching the surface. So step one is always going to be getting that data, getting all of that fuel for your fire to present back to the stakeholders, your boss, whoever it happens to be, to try to make the case to say, we're potentially excluding all of these people. They potentially control a massive amount of money that could be coming into the company, and we need to address that issue. And on top of that, when we do that, we're going to be making better emails for everybody, regardless of their abilities. All the things that Alice went through around the coding aspects, around design and readability and usability, all of those things improve the experience for all of your subscribers, even if they are perfectly able-bodied. So it's really about taking all of that data and shaping it to that stakeholder, to that person that you're presenting to, and making the case for why we should be investing into accessibility. Step two is going to be auditing your own email campaigns to see where you can make a lot of those improvements. So the importance of accessibility, but you don't specifically know where in your own email campaigns you need to make adjustments to create more accessible emails. So this is where tools like Litmus's accessibility checker really come into play, because it allows you to see where you're kind of lagging behind when it comes to email accessibility. And then you can start making a list of how you're going to tackle a lot of those issues. So like most problems, it's really about identifying the problem, stating the problem, and clearly understanding where you can make those improvements, which leads us to step three, which is planning those improvements. So after you've done that audit, you can go in and say, step by step, these are the improvements I want to make in our email campaign, and here's how it's going to significantly improve the accessibility of our emails. So all this kind of goes into presenting your case to your stakeholders, having this plan there. But you really want to identify where those improvements are and how you're going to address those. A lot of times, though, you might not necessarily have the tools or the resources, the help that you need to implement a lot of these changes. So step four is going to be identifying what tools, what additional resources you need so that you can create all these good changes for your email campaigns. So that could be anything from, using Litmus's accessibility checker to looking at third-party tools. There's a lot of browser extensions that allow you to test the accessibility of web pages, including email campaigns. A lot of them are free. There's a lot of paid tools or consulting groups that can help out, that have their own tools, their own accessibility checking suites that can help you out. But really, just like you're identifying those problems in your own emails, you're identifying the tools that you need to put into place to make these more accessible email campaigns. And then if you need to, you can get a lot of additional resources. There's tons of articles out there. There's tons of consulting groups. There's a lot of really smart, dedicated people in the accessibility space that are really devoting their lives and their work to creating these better experiences for everybody. So you can look to those resources. You can talk to those people. You can bring in third-party consulting groups if you need to. You can download a lot of those tools, those extensions. You can sign up for different services that will help you improve the accessibility of your email campaigns. You can look to get additional resources to get access to screen readers or different devices so that you can test your email campaigns in more real world environments than you would with just like a browser extension. So step 5 is really about getting those additional resources to help you on your journey of creating more accessible email campaigns for your subscribers. So it's definitely a step-by-step process, but we found that a lot of times it is really about those first couple of steps. The first one being, making the case for why we need to invest in accessibility. And then the next two being auditing your own emails and figuring out where you can make those improvements. If you can do that, then you're going to be in a really good place to create more accessible emails for all of your subscribers, which just improves their lives immensely because they don't have to contend with those wildly inaccessible emails that we heard the example of before. And it just creates better experience for everybody. So again, Litmus, we've been trying to invest a lot of our own time and our own resources into helping others create more accessible email campaigns. Again, I did want to touch on this, our new accessibility checker, which we've looked at a little bit, but definitely check that out. If you're using Litmus, if you're not using Litmus, you can get a free trial for 7 days. Just go to litmus.com. But if you are using it, start a new checklist campaign, upload one of your emails, send it in from your ESP, and see what that accessibility checker does to your emails. See where you're falling behind when it comes to accessibility, whether that's through using improper heading hierarchy in your HTML, not including those table rules or the language to attribute. It'll help you identify contrast issues. You can check the colorblind view inside of both Builder and Checklist. But one of the most important things is really listening to and reading through that screen reader transcript, because that'll let you hear how a lot of people using assistive technologies are interacting with your email campaigns. So if you're hearing issues, chances are they're hearing issues too. So we've really tried to make accessibility, for lack of a better word, more accessible to people so that they can see how important these issues are in their own email marketing campaigns. Again, if you haven't already, go to litmus.com/ebook/ultimate guide to accessibility and download the ultimate guide to email accessibility. It touches on a lot of the things we've talked about today, but it goes a lot deeper into the detail around coding and design and copywriting that will help you build these better email campaigns for all of your subscribers. Definitely check out the Litmus blog, litmus.com/blog. We've been publishing a ton of resources over there with more tips and tricks for creating more accessible emails, including Paul Airy's amazing posts on implementing that accessibility switcher, which is one of the cooler interactive things that we've seen in email recently. So litmus.com/blog, we publish all of those resources there. They're free to use, similar to our ultimate guide to email accessibility. So that's another place that we're really trying to help people create more accessible emails for all of their subscribers. And then definitely check out Litmus Live, which is our yearly event in London, Boston, and San Francisco, because we invite people that are working on kind of the cutting edge of accessibility and doing a lot of this hard work to teach everybody else in the industry how to create more accessible emails. We invite them up on stage to share all of their challenges, all of their solutions, these really tricky problems. So we have a handful of sessions this year that touch on email accessibility. So definitely take advantage of that if you can. Check out London, Boston, and San Francisco. London's only a few weeks away. Tickets for all 3 cities are getting pretty low, so I would suggest you to buy your tickets pretty quickly if you haven't already. But yeah, Litmus Live is a great way to talk to people and learn from experts that are doing a lot of this hard work in accessibility, so you can take away those lessons and implement them in your own email campaigns. So at this point, we're going to open up to questions. I've been trying to keep track of some of these questions and stuff, but I'm going to invite Whitney on to ask any of these questions that come from you, our attendees, and we can try to talk through some of these accessibility issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got quite a good number of them. So get ready to answer lots of questions, guys.
Let's do it.
Let's see. Good question from Hale. How do you account for cognitive limitations? So how can you build understanding about what works and what does not?
So I mean, there's a lot of different cognitive disabilities that people contend with. But from a lot of the research that I've read, and Alice, feel free to jump in if you think I'm missing the mark here or have anything else to add, but a lot of that comes down to a couple of things. One being simpler copy, which we talked about in the copywriting section. So really honing your message and making it as clear as possible to understand will help people with cognitive issues understand that. But from a design perspective, it's really about reinforcing the readability and that content hierarchy that we talked about in the design section, because that hierarchy, a lot of times people that have some sort of cognitive disability or some sort of reading disability, they rely on scanning through things before they actually read that content. So that hierarchy is really important for allowing people to scan through content, understand very quickly what they need to focus on before they start reading. And then some of those things like line height and alignment and text size, it will help when they actually dig into that content and start trying to digest it that way. Alice, what do you think about that one?
Yeah, I think like even if you're just like reading the copy to yourself out loud and you're like, wait, I just like lost myself, or like what was the point again? Like then you should reevaluate how to like just like simplify that and make it more clear.
Awesome. Let's see. Arturo has a good question, and I think, Alice, this will be a good one for you. What is the most used screen reader, and how do I test for it?
So a couple of the most popular screen readers are NVDA and JAWS, which is like JAWS. And both of these apps are something you can download if you have a Windows machine. I don't believe they're available for Mac at this point,
No,
but
I don't think so.
no. But fortunately, we at Litmus have our screen reader that is based on the NVDA technology, so you can always use that.
Yep, and NVDA is free to use. I think JAWS requires a subscription or a software purchase. But even if you don't have access to those two, all modern operating systems have some sort of screen reader device or software built in. So on Mac, that's VoiceOver, which is really popular and pretty easy to use and set up. I forget what Android calls theirs, but Android, Windows, they all have built-in screen reader services. But yeah, NVDA and JAWS seem to be the big ones that I usually hear about too.
Cool. Sarah is looking for some inspiration. So what are some brands that do a great job optimizing their emails for accessibility?
I feel like that is a good question, and but a potentially hard one to answer because it depends on so many things like design and code and kind of auditing all that stuff on a brand by brand basis. But I generally feel like one of the biggest things is just using that real text, which Alice mentioned, instead of all image-based emails. So really anybody that's doing that is going to have a leg up when it comes to accessibility. I would say, Alice, you've put in a ton of work to try to make the Litmus emails as accessible as possible. So you know, try not to toot our own horn or anything, but I feel like our emails, especially over the last year or so since you've been with us, have been amazing kind of examples of how to create more accessible emails.
Oh, yeah. So I also like would recommend going to you know, websites that promote accessibility, like any kind of A11Y website, and signing up for their newsletters, and most likely they're going to have a great accessible experience.
Yeah, one of my favorites is DeQ, I think is the company, DEQUE. And they do a lot of accessibility training. They have an amazing blog that talks about all kinds of accessibility issues. But I found their emails to be great too, you know, obviously relying more on text, and they go out of their way to make more accessible email experiences. But not only is it like a good accessible newsletter, but it talks about accessibility, which is awesome too. So I definitely recommend theirs as well.
Awesome. Stephen is looking for any insight into how tools like Alexa or Siri differ from other screen readers or Outlook's read aloud feature, for example.
Yeah, so I could probably talk about this because I just did a podcast episode. So Litmus does the Delivering podcast. So last Friday, I released an episode that talks about voice-enabled technology like Alexa and Google Home Mini and all that good stuff. I'm waiting for one of them to go off in my office because they're set up and they'll probably hear themselves and activate. But when it comes to email, in my own testing, I found that really Alexa's the only one that goes through and like reads your emails. And the way it does that is just by looking at that text. So it won't read out any like alt attributes or anything like that. It'll go through and just read the HTML text. So whatever text you happen to have, if it's plain text email, it'll read that out. And those devices aren't really they're not necessarily geared towards like accessibility and being like a full-blown screen reader experience. So people largely still need like actual laptops or desktop computers or need to activate something like VoiceOver on iOS to get that full experience. So I definitely don't think it's like a replacement for that, but it's good to hear how it reads your content out. And it'll generally like follow, some of the screen reader stuff, but it'll just read out the text part of it. It won't go into like attributes or tables or like reading anything out that we heard before. And Alexa is really the only one that does that. Siri will read out like the sender name and the subject line, but then it'll kick you over to the actual mail application to read your email visually. Google Home Mini doesn't even have email capability like that skill built in yet, which is surprising because Gmail's the most popular email client out there now, which we showed in like a recent report. But yeah, it's kind of two different things. Like they're more of a convenience thing than a replacement for like dedicated screen reader software.
All right, Alice, let's talk animated GIFs and accessibility. Ryan wants to know if he should use them or not. Do they cause issues for screen readers?
I would say you can use them, but be very careful about how you create them. So, for example, avoid using animations that may be too jarring, that have a lot of like flashing or like shakiness involved, because that might like trigger epilepsy or any kind of visual disabilities. And you don't want to include like crucial information like copy in your animated GIFs either, which not only like apply for accessibility concerns, but also for people who might be viewing on email clients that don't support animated GIFs. Like older versions of Outlook, for example, they only show the first frame of your GIF. So I would say yes, use them, but be very aware of how you make them and what you include in them.
All right. Laura is wondering, so for image alt text, do you need to explain what's happening in the image, or does using the headline work? So for example, if you're putting alt text on a sale banner, can you just use summer sale up to 50% off? Or do you also need to include something like, summer sale up to 50% off, button reads shop now, image of a beach with a sunset?
I would say definitely include all of the copy that's in it. You might not want to leave in the description of the image because like it just adds to the extra noise and again kind of detracts from your overall message. You might not need to put in button reads shop now, but if you want to just end it with shop now, that could be ideal as well. Just basically pare it down to whatever your main like copy is.
I would add on to that too, is kind of, I think it's definitely dependent on like the surrounding copy. So a lot of times you'll have like the hero image that has that headline, like whatever that sale happens to be. But then below that too, you have like another heading that kind of repeats that information. So if you do have that like elsewhere in the copy and it's like really close to that, or it's kind of like repeating that information, then it might be worthwhile to not like just treat that image as a decorative image since that copy is repeated elsewhere. So really not like duplicating that content, because it could be frustrating for users to hear that twice.
Yeah,
And
good point.
I feel like this is where like hearing your email read by a screen reader is so important, because that'll let you know whether or not you're duplicating things and where you should try to adjust your copy, and whether or not you want to use a decorative image or include actual alt text and all that stuff.
So, related to thinking of all of these things for use in our emails, where can we find good examples of accessible email templates?
That's a good question. So we actually, along with the Ultimate Guide to Email Accessibility, we released a couple of accessible email templates on the Litmus community. So if you go to litmus.com/community/templates, you'll be able to find those in there, and I believe they're labeled like accessible emails, and then whatever it happens to be. But that's a handful of templates that'll kind of heavily commented to inside of the HTML code to explain like why certain things are the way they are in the code. But those are a good place to find them. And outside of that, I feel like there might be a couple of things over on GitHub. I know Wilbert Heinen is friend of Litmus and really active in the email community. He has a GitHub repository around email accessibility resources, and I believe it probably links out to a couple of templates as well. But really, if you're just looking at templates, look at some of those key things that Alice was talking about around using, role equals presentation, role equals none, using semantic HTML, using alt text properly, and that'll help inform whether or not something is going to be good for accessibility.
Awesome. Jake is wondering, so some of his clients are starting to ask about fancier elements like in-email survey dropdowns, radio buttons, etc. Is there a way to optimize those for accessibility?
That is a very good question. Well, it's kind of difficult to ensure that interactivity is accessible in email to begin with, but to start off with, definitely use like the semantic tag elements in it, so that if people are able to interact with it, then they can use their screen readers and assistive devices to interact with the correct elements. If you can also make sure you have ARIA tags to indicate like what their role is for. And I think that's all I can think about. Do you have any insights, Jason?
I'm definitely deferring to you, as you're the kind of queen of accessibility or interactivity in email. But I would think that using semantics as much as possible is probably like the key here.
Oh, and of course, sorry.
No, go for it, please.
But like, definitely have a very, very solid fallback version.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say, is like look at the fallback version, and if it makes sense, because that's what a lot of people are going to be seeing or like hearing read out by a screen reader, then if it makes sense, then you should be good. I feel like just hearing and like looking at that email in a different context than what you're used to is just kind of a good rule of thumb.
So we had a number of people message in and ask about emoticons and subject lines, wondering how they were read by screen readers and if there's a danger that some aren't recognized.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a danger that some aren't recognized, and it just kind of like reads out. It's dependent on like what screen reader you're using, but it'll say something like smiley face or laughing face, or it'll read out what that emoji actually is. So from like an audio perspective, I feel like emoji just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Like, it's a very visual medium. So you kind of want to be careful, but I also feel like emoji is so popular these days that people using assistive technology are probably used to hearing them and familiar like with what those are, and used to them being inside of their content. So it's probably not a massive issue. But yeah, I think it's definitely dependent on the screen reader and how they read those things out.
All right, let's see. Melanie was wondering, so they have a headline that's part of an image that they tag with an alt tag, and they've got role equals heading and ARIA level equals 1. Melanie's wondering if that's enough.
I'm going to defer to you on this one, Alice.
So when Melanie says part of an image, does she mean like it's inside the image, or is it like a linked in the same anchor tag as an image? Because I guess if it is like an image text situation, then that should be enough. But if it is like you have an image and then copy and they're both like linked within the same A tag, then I would say it would be more semantically correct to wrap it in like an H1 tag instead. But role heading in ARIA level 1 is kind of like a way to substitute for an H1 tag, so that's fine too. It's just not natively built in like it would be for an H1 tag.
Got it. Let's see. Tyler is asking, any pointers for convincing the rest of my company to start working on accessibility when they already have a full plate of work?
Yeah, I feel like that kind of leads back to that convincing your team section that was towards the end of the webinar here. I would say the main thing is just looking at all that data around accessibility and why it's important, and reading those reports about how many people deal with a lot of these issues and how much money they potentially control, because any business, a team that has a full plate, when it comes down to it, they're all working towards in improving the health of the company and the financials of the company. So if you can make that case about this potentially huge audience that you're excluding by not creating accessible emails, and then all the money that they potentially control, it'll help kind of make the case that this is something that should be prioritized. But I would say that none of this stuff, I feel like the visual design aspects, the copywriting could potentially take more time than some of the coding things, just because a lot of the code stuff is like including role equals presentation on all of your tables. That's not a hard thing to do. It's not like a time consuming thing to add into code while you're developing an email campaign. So I feel like even if you are strapped for time, any of these changes you can make will be improvements when it comes to email accessibility. So just making those small changes will be a good thing to do, and it's usually stuff you can work in your usual process. And even if you are burdened by all these campaigns that you're working on and all kinds of other different things that email marketers have to deal with. So I feel like it's not a huge ask to do some of these changes, but for the bigger things like readdressing your copywriting or localizing and translating content or overhauling your visual design, then just using a lot of that research and a lot of those data points that we've talked about and that we include in the Ultimate Guide to Email Accessibility will help you prioritize those things.
Cool. I know we're coming up on time, so I think we'll finish with one more question. If there is one thing you should do, at the end of the day, if there's one thing you should do with email accessibility, what would it be?
Ooh, Alice, I'll let you go first.
Oh, I think the simplest, like easiest thing to do that could make the biggest impact is just to add role presentation to all your tables, because that's just a simple find and replace, and it'll make such a huge difference in your screen reader experience.
Yeah, I would say I would agree with that as well. But since she took that one, I will say the other good thing is using real text as opposed to all image-based emails. Even if you're using alternative text on all those images, it's still not going to be an ideal experience for a lot of subscribers. So the more real HTML, like true text you can work in your email campaign, the better you're going to be, because that allows people that are using assistive technology to listen to that content read back to them. And it allows people that don't even have to worry about assistive technology to read that content when email clients block images and all that good stuff. So I feel like those two combined, you're going to be well on your way for creating better emails. Cool. I think we're at top of the hour here. So once again, thanks everybody for joining us during our email accessibility webinar. Definitely check out all of our resources at limits.com/blog. We post a lot around email accessibility and talk about a lot more than that we just have in the webinar today. And be sure to download the Ultimate Guide to Email Accessibility at limits.com/ebook/ultimate guide to email accessibility. Definitely check out the blog in the next couple of days. We'll post the recap and address some of those questions that we didn't get to today. And we'll also make the recording available for anybody that wasn't able to join and sign on. And we'll see you in our next webinar. Cheers.